Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Anti-Oedipus reading group. Today we'll be going over the first half of Anti-Oedipus Chapter 3, which is titled Savages, Barbarians, and Civilized Men. Today I am joined by many lovely members of this reading group and some Deleuzian scholars, or at least one Deleuzian scholar. But would y'all like to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Go ahead, Charles. Sorry.
No, you go on. Go on.
Oh well, I was here for the last one. Cam and you and I are friends. I'm friends with most of you here. I'm in various stages of our acquaintanceship, but I translate French philosophy and co-host of Machine Unconscious Happy Hour, and always happy to jump in and discuss these kind of things.
I guess I should jump in here and get it out of the way. I'm just a gadfly working on Deleuze, and my most recent project has been to help Dan Smith with the Deleuze Seminars site, which he began in some ways back in 2011, but officially, that is money dedicated to creating the site from about 2015 or 2016 onward. And so we're getting there. We're close to having it completed. And so but it's probably gonna take a couple more years just because of funding issues. So anyhow, that's what I've been doing. It's been quite a journey. So hate using that word, but I just did. So there you
go. Hey, I'm Griffin. I came to Deleuze through reading Marx, and so that's perhaps maybe the orientation that I come from. But yeah, I've been, once I encountered Anti-Oedipus, I don't know, I'm sure you all have had a similar experience where it really grabs you, and so I've been kind of working my own way through it, and this is my second time through the text, but my first real rigorous time with it. So I'm excited to discuss things with you all.
Hi, I'm John. I'm in year 5, 6, 7, who knows, of my dissertation, PhD, and which it's not about Deleuze, but uses a lot of Deleuze. And I came to this book through a grad course on Spinoza's Marxisms, Hart and Negri, etc., the sort of autonomism and workerism and all this stuff, and how important he was to those sort of 70s, 80s movements. And I've just sort of stuck with it. And that stuff has kind of faded to the back of my life, and this has come to the forefront. And this is my third or fourth read through, and I'm psyched. It's great to have an excuse to go through chapter 3 again. It's my favorite one.
I think this is my turn because Taylor started, right? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I am Mahmoud. I am a writer in Arabic from Egypt, and I am a translator between Arabic and English. I'm doing my PhD in comparative literature. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Great. I'm doing my PhD in comparative literature at University of Southern California. I'm going to my 5th year now, and I work mainly on ecological apocalypse between the Arab world and Latin America in literature, film, and photography. So for Deleuze, I think I started reading Deleuze for my work on Etel Adnan. She's a Lebanese American poet, and thinking of her as a minor literature, an Arab writing in French and then in English. And then I found that Deleuze in some way became the body without organs for my dissertation. Like it became like this plane of immanence that allows me to build my own chapters and dissertation chapters around him and using him and thinking with him, because he is this kind of like moving between different places. He's not just one Deleuze, he is Deleuze's. So yeah, so I think this is just for now.
We
Oh,
got
Cam.
one more joining us here. Welcome, Hunter. Well, I guess I'll introduce myself, at least last for right now. I came to Deleuze, I guess, through a mix of starting philosophy with Mark Fisher, as well as having one of my friends who did philosophy, having taken a course on Deleuze and Guattari in their grad program, and I guess that rubbing off on me eventually. But I'm a, I guess, rising senior philosophy undergrad who is preparing to do a senior thesis on, I guess, Deleuze and ethics, which is a question I don't see very often answered, though there are a few here and there, like Todd May and others, that do care about that question, even if I believe it still has not been answered completely. But I started, for those that do not know, who have not either seen the previous one, the previous sessions, or etc. I wanted to do this reading group in order to get through the Anti-Oedipus text a second time and just become better educated in it, because I did want it to be kind of this principal text in my senior thesis. I guess that's a good introduction here. I really wanted to start us, as I try to always do in every reading group, before we go chapter by chapter, to try and get kind of what were people's general thoughts going into this chapter. Some of y'all have read this for longer than I've been alive. Some of y'all have been reading this for a couple of years. So I imagine this is going to come off with a lot of varying different answers. Anybody can go first.
I apologize. Can you restate the question you would like us to field here?
Just kind of like I guess a general overview of everything. Or like when going through the chapter, what were these, I guess, the big picture items rather than the chapter by chapter thoughts you were having? What do you think is like important for anybody going into this chapter to just kind of really get, or what was important when you were going through this chapter the last time or two, that really helped click for you?
I mean, I'll start with one thing, and I guess we can go around. One of the things that I think is important to remember, and I know, I believe this is, I'm stealing from Charles here, just thinking about the last time we spoke, where, always historicize, right? So just the layout of the chapter, if you will, the fact that they start with, introducing desire in chapter 1 and how it functions, and then they kind of go into this critique of psychoanalysis. It's in chapter 3 that it's kind of showing this is not just a universalist framework, but taking up kind of Marx's universal history, this history of desiring machines and sociuses has to be framed, what do they say, retrospectively, critically, ironically. What are the other adjectives or adverbs?
Singular, contingent.
Singular and contingent. Yes, thank you. So I think it's important they lay that out right from the start before really diving in, and it's good to keep that in mind.
Yeah. Yeah, my take. I mean, I when I was looking around on the internet, I found an essay. Well, it's actually not an essay; it's a set of notes by Michael Hart, which helped get me back into this chapter. And his notes are basically a real quick thumbnail sketch of what's going on in this long chapter. And I gotta say, this is the one I penetrated the least, most in my readings, except that I eventually came to it by way of I wrote an essay on Apocalypse Now using the universal history type movement as a way of structuring Apocalypse Now back from capitalism upstream to the earth and the flows and so forth of Kurtz's compound. And so that's always been my frame of reference to it. So I've been refamiliarized myself this afternoon with what I wrote back then. And, oh my God, nothing self-indulgent about that. And but it helped me sort of situate this chapter in a lot of ways. I should also mention I've recently done a deep dive into Guattari's Anti-Oedipus papers, the notes that he was writing in 1970 to 72, simultaneously with beginning his collaboration with Deleuze on Anti-Oedipus, and then shifting gears into 1,000 Plateaus. And so a lot of the stuff that he writes in his notes gradually emerge into this text. But one of the things I realized more clearly in reading his notes and then filtering them back into the text that they produced was that he was this I don't know how to describe it. He was this text machine that would just turn stuff out. He was he was really known to be a sort of a hyper guy with ideas and constantly producing ideas. And Deleuze gave him this task of settling down and actually writing, because that was one of the hardest things that Guattari had to do. He was more of an action guy. He wasn't a word guy, at least written word guy. And Deleuze gave him the task starting in summer of '69 to get on with your writing, get on with writing something, writing your notes, and write up the notes between them. And what they did was they met face to face on a fairly regular basis, but they passed notes between each other, couriered notes back and forth. And Deleuze would read Guattari's notes and then send ideas back to him, annotated on the notes, and then Deleuze's own notes. And gradually, over a period of a couple of years, they ended up producing 1,000 Plateaus, Anti-Oedipus this way. But one really gets the sense, both from what Guattari says explicitly and also the way things come out, that Deleuze was the filter. Deleuze was the guy who, if you think of just how many texts he produced in the 1960s, starting with the Nietzsche book, I mean, he was a guy who was plugged in, if you will, to the publishing machine. And so here he had this raw data that he was highly attuned to because of his ongoing discussions with Guattari, the ideas that they were building together and so forth, the concepts they were building together. And but he was getting this raw data, and then he was, if you will, filtering it, distilling it, moving it into a direction of something that was more of a coherent flow. Because if you haven't looked at the Anti-Oedipus papers, Guattari just spits it out there. It is truly, in some of the chapters, just a spew of stuff, and yet you recognize it, particularly if you're involved in reading 1,000 Plateaus, Anti-Oedipus. You recognize it, and also 1,000 Plateaus, in fact, because one of the amazing things about the Anti-Oedipus papers is precisely how much they produce that doesn't get into Anti-Oedipus. And so basically it was almost predetermined that they would have to come up with a second volume, given how much Guattari was putting out there. But anyway, so I sort of got involved thinking about what Guattari was doing and going through the big picture items here in chapter 3, how it connects back to chapter 1 in a really obvious way in that first section, and then beginning to lay out each of the sections in two and 3. I was amused this afternoon. I was reading, I came along to this long section of number 4, psychoanalysis and ethnology. I realized that they'd done so much research on ethnology that they kind of say time out, although they don't quite say it, but it's time out for the ethnology moment, because and then they had to sort of bring in, if you will, the bona fides of the work that they were doing, and then they moved back into the succession of their movement towards capitalism. But anyhow, that's sort of my big picture response to this. Way too long. Apologies.
No, that was great, and I do love. I think I do think it's fascinating. Oftentimes, working with a text that you're familiar with. Like for me, I've gotten a lot out of reading some of Marx's early manuscripts that then later formed his work, like the Grundrisse. And so I think it's always fascinating to see that. But I guess to go back to the question at hand, obviously for me, I have found a lot of help in this chapter through Marx. I would say the two big pieces are obviously, as they reference right at the beginning, this little section in the introduction from the Grundrisse, where Marx kind of outlines his own. I don't think he refers to it as a universal history, but as he's critiquing the methods of the political economists, he begins to outline this system of rules. I posted in the Discord, in case anyone is interested, some of the pages that they reference. There's a couple paragraphs in particular that I think are you can quite evidently see for D&G. But the other one is Capital Volume 2. I think this being my second time through the chapter, I think fixed capital and circulating capital, Marx spends multiple chapters digging into the various ways that one can misunderstand the concepts. And so he really hammers them in when you're reading it. And I think this second time around, I found it very compelling, the ways in which they kind of almost do a genealogy, or maybe not a genealogy, but they do say that these that the filiative and the alliant form a kind of, I think they call it a primitive forms of fixed and circulating capital. And maybe we'll get into that later. But anyway, if anyone is ever struggling with this chapter, I would recommend some of the Volume 2 chapters where he outlines those, because I've found them very helpful.
Yeah, if I could just respond to Charles really quick. I mean, what is I think Deleuze says in an interview once that Guattari and I would have made a good sumo wrestler. Like if you took us, both of us, and you put us in one body, we would have made a good, which is probably the most beautiful thing I think you can say about a friend. And I think what he's getting at there, is that Guattari is the arms, the sort of like constant shifting of weight and pushing, and and Deleuze is the feet, is the base of weight and the sort of constant movement forward. And so, I mean, and that to me brought, like, what was really interesting to me about this section is the way that these polarities in the chapter between filiation and alliance, between the nomad and the despot, between sort of contingency and necessity, even sort of pass into each other. Like the chapter is structured around these polarities, right? And at privileged moments, one pole is infinitized, and it's revealed as passing into the other, right? Like on 148, the characteristics of the hunter. He is the great paranoiac of the bush, and the paranoiac becomes, a few dozen pages later, the despot becomes Oedipus, right? Like, but the hunter, the nomad, is supposed to be the opposite of the Oedipalized figure. Like, so it's just the way that this chapter is structured is just so troubling. And I mean, like, I don't like, but this is a move that Deleuze does over and over again throughout his career, where one term of a polarity is infinitized and then transformed into the other. This happens in smooth and striated space. This happens in, a lot of the great pieces of plateaus. So I've been really trying to track those this time around, and I hadn't recognized that the last time I went through this. It's good, is my opinion, but it's not Hegelian. It's not like a Hegelian, becoming, the negation of the negation, but it's something else. It's
Right. I don't know. The sumo wrestler, I think I'll just leave that. I think Taylor, I read your note, which is, I think it had to do with who he was writing to, somebody in Japan. So that sort of probably made sense. As for the pairing, the couplets that you point out, I'm fascinated to see where they finally slip into when he goes to a third move. Because the pairings tend to, you point out something really, interesting. That's not just, of course, in this volume, but in A Thousand Plateaus as well. This and that, smooth, striated, and so forth and so on. But when they get to the third, and that's not necessarily not necessarily an Aufhebung, if you will, like a going beyond, but it's a lot of times it's part of a circulation, as it were. I think in the becoming chapter in particular of A Thousand Plateaus, how there's a constant movement going on there. You think of the territorialization, deterritorialization, reterritorialization as a triad that's constantly this constant circulation. And I think I think you see that here. I mean, we're moving from one, two, and three into a third. Eventually, next meeting to the capitalist system, but yeah, okay. I just lost my train of thought there. But let me stop before I start babbling. But it sounds like, I hear what you're saying and trying to track those as something important. Because I'm looking at the threes, trying to see where the threes connect with those twos, because there's too many twos, and let me have a few more threes, please, so we can move a little bit forward here in our thinking.
Oh, thank you. That's great. Yeah. No, you.
No, if you have something.
Mhm.
I have a very general question to Charles also, but I will have my own thought about the chapter in general. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm going to put the headphones on though, just
Okay, great.
because I got a fan. It's a little warm in this bedroom, so got a fan on me. There you go.
So I have really a quick question about it's a general style and voice of both of them in between Anti-Oedipus to minor literature until we reach A Thousand Plateau, and then we go to what's philosophy, because I think there's something happening in this kind of a chain. Like, I feel all time from reading Guattari by himself, I feel all time that we here still trying to move around this raw material, that the voice, the style here is like a raw material, doesn't take its full shape. And even the concepts like body without organs and desiring machines, they are not taking their full shape until we go to A Thousand Plateaus. So the body without organs became 3 categories, and the desiring machine became the assemblage. So there's a kind of movement, as if like this is there was there was their first try to writing together. So there's a kind also of limitation of their first try. I don't know what you think about that. So to go back to Cameron's question about like my general thought about this chapter, I think one of the most important thing here, maybe also Michael Hart explanation or notes on this chapter helped me a lot actually. This kind of how to trace the Oedipus in moving between these three categories. From the savage to the barbarians to the civilized. And I remember when I was watching, because it made me think a lot about a Chilean director, Patricio Guzman. He has a film called Pearl Bottom or Botón de Nácar. And in this film, he is making interview with one of the indigenous people, a group of indigenous people in Chile, Kawasca. And he asks a woman about the words in her own native language. And he asks her like, what is the sea? What does the sea mean? Son, father, mother. And he comes to say God. And she takes like few seconds and say, we don't have this in our language. So I'm thinking of God, like the God figure as like a kind of embodiment of the idea of Oedipus here in some way. So this is like in the native, like the savages, whatever, like when you think about this kind of early communities, and then we go to the ancient Egyptians, for example, because I'm from Egypt. So you have this idea of how the pharaoh, the king, is half God, half human. And from this kind of duality, like from this kind of composition, he gets this kind of power, the despot power. And then when you think about the ancient Egyptian religion as one of the first religions also, so you think of religion in this case as the overcoding in the societies. In some way, I think at least in the ancient Egyptian case, religion can be one of the clearest examples of how overcoding was really like the factory of everything, how everything was functioning. Like the first thing that we will be asked about when you go to the afterlife as an ancient Egyptian, did you pollute the river Nile? So this is the first question. Like, so yeah. Yeah, this is just my own, like how to trace the Oedipus from there is no word for God, for the Kawasca, to how the king is half God, half human, and he has this religious apparatus and the idea to Oedipus in the capitalized. So all of this were like helping me a lot to think of the genealogy of development. Of course, this is like there is, as one of you was saying, it is not a Hegelian dialect, but it's also a total contingency. Like maybe we would be in a completely different track if there's something else happened.
Does anybody else have any, I guess, final general remarks before we start going chapter by chapter?
Let me give a quick response to Mahmoud, because he asked me a specific question about voice and style.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think you're right to note the difference of voice between what Guattari produced himself and what he produced with Deleuze. Because like I said earlier, there's a definite distillation that's going on of the Guattari's, if you will, raw material towards the collaborative text. The minor literature one, the Kafka minor literature one is an interesting side project. I kind of got the feeling that they needed to publish this separate book in some ways because it risked taking over too much space if it was included in 1,000 Plateaus, and that it might not have, gelled as fully as a plateau, and it really took on its own life, particularly because Guattari was writing a lot of his notes about Kafka as he was writing things to Deleuze and sending him stuff, both to Deleuze and Deleuze's wife Fanny. So yeah, I think that's a smart, it's a key insight. Let me just have you think back though to it that where Taylor mentioned sort of the historical framework here. Think about the fact that before summer of 1969, these two men had never met, never had collaborated. And between summer of 1969 and March of 1972, that's the gestation of Anti-Oedipus. And also think that we're in a pre-digital era. So in terms of producing a book in that era, we went through all the old ways of editing a book. And that usually was with a good editor, a 4-month prep time, given all that you needed to do in submitting the manuscript and getting it proofed and so forth. So let's assume that they had to have it in by the end of 1971. So before Christmas of 1971. But we're really talking less that they started getting up to speed and working. And so they really were focused. And so they now pick up your book and look at its organization and the way that it's laid out. The more I think about that, this kind of sort of restrained focus on this time frame, I find it absolutely amazing that it got produced in this shorter period of time. And there's no wonder it took another 8 years to bring out 1,000 Plateaus, particularly given the way that they were working together. But particularly given the way they're working together, to be able to get this book out in such a short frame of time, it just strikes me as amazing. So there's going to be a lot of Guattari disappearing in order for the Deleuze machine, as it were, the Deleuze production machine, publishing machine, to crank it out. They're with Deleuze's publisher, Minuit. He started with Minuit with Logic of Sense. So this is his second book with them, and boy, what a backlog this book is, because it's never been out of print, of course, and never stopped selling. But it really strikes me as kind of an amazing text, all on its own, just as a production, as a book, collaborated with a joint collaboration between these two guys who were doing other things in their life too. Deleuze is teaching in a new location, starting in the early 70s. So anyhow, that's sort of a sidebar, but you jogged me thinking about that in terms of the voice issue, because they, if you will, this is sort of working out the kinks. Anti-Oedipus was sort of working out the kinks of their collaboration, and then once they started getting into a groove, let's ease back, because we got a lot more plateaus to deal with. We've dealt with the psychoanalytical plateau, and we've dealt sort of with the Marxian plateau, and we laid out our little program for schizoanalysis. Okay, that's all good, but now let's get on to laying out a plan for the future, and which correspond, if you think of the way that Guattari was producing and the different texts that Guattari was producing in the 1970s, and they came out in the early 80s. They got these two parallel projects going on. And for Deleuze, it was the main project. Guattari was suddenly getting into his own and coming out with his own books, because the 70s was a good time for him. I noticed somebody made a comment about Deleuze introduced Guattari to the university discourse, which is not untrue. It's certainly something to be said, and neither of them were terribly pleased with that fact. And they acknowledged it in interviews that it wasn't all that they had hoped for. But Guattari, on the other hand, obviously got the writing bug, and Deleuze pushed him towards that in a way that was, for those who are more into Guattari than Deleuze, that's something that's an amazing outcome for this collaboration.
Hey, Cam, before we start, I had a really quick question for Charles. Charles, this may be dealt with in the DOS biography, and I may have just missed it, but, you mentioned the Anti-Oedipus papers and the fact that, by the time Anti-Oedipus was published, there's already a chunk of not only like the Kafka book, but perhaps some of A Thousand Plateaus already at least in inchoate form. Do you know if Anti-Oedipus was originally published as volume 1 of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, or did that become a later thing? It was. Okay.
Oh, so, yeah, I'm looking at the cover of the book, the French book right here.
Okay,
above L'Anti-Oedipus is in French Capitalism and Schizophrenia. So, it was seen as a major project, and I guess the idea of 2 volumes was there from the start. I'm not sure. Again, when do you design the cover?
Right.
So summer 71, the beginning into the editing process, and Deleuze and Guattari go, we got a lot of stuff here.
Right.
This is definitely Capitalism and Schizophrenia, part 1. And
good to know.
So I don't know if Does address that, but it's in terms of editorially, that's the way it is from the get-go.
Thank you, everyone, for your opening remarks is probably the best way to put it, for the general part of the chapter. I guess if I have anything to offer, which I guess probably everybody, at least here today, already knows, this is kind of the, as we've kind of discussed already with this being like the ethnology chapter, this is the one where you don't need necessarily a philosophical background, but a background in sociology and archaeology for everything to kind of click. So getting into Bataille, and I don't know, everybody I hear pronounce this name pronounces it differently, but Marcel Mauss, Mauss, okay. I've heard like 10 people say it in 10 different ways, so I'm completely confused. But that helped me a lot. I guess having read the more anthropological text has helped me a lot kind of go through this, and between now and reading it last year, just over time, being able, as I read Bataille, as I read Mauss, as I read I guess even Weber, kind of being able to go back and be like, oh, I remember this from Deleuze, this all makes sense now. This is probably the biggest chapter on the this makes sense now part. But if everybody's ready, we can turn to what is at least 139 in the Penguin edition of Anti-Oedipus. I know there's 2 other popular editions, but this is the beginning of Savages, Barbarians, Civilized Men, with section 1, the inscribing Socius, which kind of gets us the basic kind of, it really just discusses the beginning of everything they're going to talk about for the rest of the chapter. It's really more of an introduction than, I guess, I don't want to say it's not necessarily a chapter on its own, but it does kind of go over the whole, what the next 10 sections of this chapter are going to discuss, more than being specific in its own right. Did anybody have any kind of, I guess, big quotes, big thoughts on this first section here?
So I don't know if Griffin will agree with me on this, but I was struck by just how much, to my eyes anyway, the reading of Marx is the Althusserian reading. The universal history is the history of contingencies, not of necessity, ruptures and limits, not continuity. The great accidents were necessary and amazing encounters that could have happened elsewhere or before or never, in order for the flows to escape coding and escaping to nonetheless fashion a new machine bearing the determinations of the socius, right? Like this is, I mean, this paragraph here, I guess it's what the second major paragraph of the section, feels like a sort of distillation of the theses of Reading Capital and of the Althusserian structuralist Marxists, at least to my eyes. And that itself is such an interesting way of positioning yourself, because that is not the only reading of Marx that's available in France at the time. That is, in fact, a sort of, depending on where you stand vis-a-vis the party, depending on where you stand politically, like vis-a-vis Maoism, like, you know, there are, I want to understand more what their Marx is and what Guattari's Marx is, because that to me feels very much like a Guattari remark. Hence, it is correct to retrospectively understand all history in light of capitalism, provided the rules of Marx formulated by Marx are followed exactly. That is Guattari to a T in a way, and his sort of style of address. And so I want to, yeah, I guess if anybody else has a sense of this, like, you know, do we recognize their Marx today? Is it a Marx that is worth working with in the way that they do? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know if you're interested in a reading on this specifically, Guattari it's in, oh man, I know.
I shared this with you. It's the
Yeah, you did.
It's the 9 theses on the left opposition. Is that what it's called, I believe?
9 theses on the left opposition, which of course, you know,
In
left
psychoanalysis
opposition.
and transversality, that volume.
Yeah, I believe so. But anyway, before this, Guattari was a part of a sort of Trotskyist adjacent group, and he, I believe, was sort of the primary author of that document, but there were some other members of the group that wrote that. But if you want to get a sense of where they were at, which, to summarize briefly, they were very critical of the French Communist Party. They were very critical of you know, being Trotskyists, of quote unquote socialism in one country, and that kind of notion. So yeah, I would agree that they are a kind of structuralist Marx. And I do think, you know, historically it's useful to remember that this is right. The Grundrisse and the Paris manuscripts had only recently been published, and the Grundrisse especially is, as they reference a lot, plays at least in my eye, a very big factor, because the Grundrisse was, of course, when Marx transitioned from, you know, essentially 15 years of research into really trying to formulate his project. So I would say that yeah, they definitely are a kind of structuralist Marxism, and a one that, in my eye, they very much, and I do think that this also lines up with my own reading of Marx, but that they are very much emphasize the kind of the totality of the capitalist economy itself, and in the sense of, you know, you cannot you know, simply conceive of some small part of it outside of the whole. And I do think that ultimately stems into how Deleuze uses sort of the manifolds, or the multiplicities to sort of yeah. Anyway, hopefully that's helpful.
No, it's totally interesting. Like I'm because then that to me messes with the American narrative, right, of this book, which is that it's the book of 68. Like, it's the great book until Badiou's being an event of, like, the great theoretical text of 1968, right? And Althusser and the structuralists opposed to 68. They sort of condemned the student uprising. They took the party line, as far as I know, to the point that even the students defaced the building Althusser taught with graffiti that said, what is Althusser for? Is the famous line. I forget what it is in French, but it was, what is structures do not march in the streets. This sort of like, there are all of these sort of academic slogans that were levied against the structuralist in this moment. And I mean, this book is seen as, so I mean, for them to adopt and endorse a structuralist Marx in order to kind of turn it on its head in a way is, to me, totally fascinating as a just intellectual historical moment that I have not heard in the academy and that I hadn't really noticed until this read through.
Yeah, I can't speak much for Althusser because I haven't got to as much as I probably should have by now. But I guess concerning that, a big question for me, especially going through this chapter, was kind of how do we get Marx's materialist history without the Hegel, really? Like, how do we expertly cut out the Hegel bits and get to the parts that Marx had? And I think it ends up, and I pretty much only picked up Capital for the post 1848 writings from Marx. But it does seem that they end up leaning a lot on like the Darwinian influence that Marx had coming into Capital, if not slightly before Capital. But that kind of, having read through the Working Day this year, the chapter on the Working Day, which I believe is chapter 10 of Capital, volume 1.
Yeah, it's chapter 10.
I think like they do have a valid basis for the argument they pose here on literally the second paragraph of this first chapter, that kind of Marx is already talking about these coincidences, these random contingencies that just kind of all line up and lead towards this kind of new mode of production, new unconscious, etc. Over this long period of history, because the Working Day starts with like the end of the Black Plague. That's the furthest back in history it literally starts at. And it's just all these random events kind of end up. It's not this grand history leading necessarily towards this beautiful utopia that either Hegel or Marx kind of promises, whether or not Marx still thought about that at the time, because he does kind of have to end his sociological research in 1864, just out of being stuck in 1864. But it just kind of having that in the back of my mind going through this time, and being able to see I guess the breadth of thought that they have on history, at least up to capitalism, in this first half of the chapter, you kind of do see how it isn't these grand movements of necessity. It's these little moments just kind of start adding up to these big moments, to put it in probably the simplest terms I can. And these laws, these actions by certain individuals, whether they're grand historical persons or not, just kind of all culminate in, I guess, feudalism or the despotic machine falling apart and becoming the capitalist machine in some way or another, mattering on where you're at. That's kind of my contribution to like what Griffin and Jonathan talking about. I do think that they not only did Althusser, I guess this is his interpretation, there's a valid claim, I guess, to be had that Marx already kind of falls into this contingent formation for materialist history come the 1860s. But is there anybody else that kind of wanted to bring up anything else in this first section?
I guess if nobody else has anything, I will say one thing that I found fascinating. I also sort of in preparation for this, I read through a good section of Marx and Engels's letters from the time, and one thing that I found very fascinating with relation to Hegel, because I think points of discussion on Marx's relationship to Hegel, at least I find very interesting. Because I think that there are a wide variety of accounts of, especially in his, from the Grundrisse on, his specific relationship to Hegel. I'm trying to find it, but if I can't get the specific quote, he was writing to Engels about Lassalle, or however you want to pronounce it, and Lassalle was also influenced by Hegel, and was in fact at the time working on his own sort of Hegelian political economy text. And Marx was critiquing him specifically because of how much Hegel he was using, and in the sense that he said a line something along the lines of, Hegel is a lot more important for presentation than for investigation, which I found very interesting. But I do think that you can. I think in many ways the kind of the multiplicity kind of takes over the position of the sort of traditional dialectic in Deleuze and Guattari, in the sense of, for them that is how you get from use value to exchange value, right? The surface of the market takes the sort of how would you say, the smooth and the and turns it into these definitive quantities of value. And so I don't know if that made much sense, but I do think that there are at least ways very much of reading Marx, and I think that is how they read Marx, that sort of not so much excises Hegel, but sort of supplants him, if that makes sense. At least that's what I get out of it.
Right, like it's a Spinozist Marx and not a Hegelian Marx, right? Like it's an attempt to kind of excise Diamat from Capital, or like the sort of the legacy of dialectical materialism and Stalinism.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, the more modern Marx readings do, very much sort of oppose, because I think the concept of dialectical materialism as it existed, for the USSR or at the time, was quite different from, I think, Marx's materialism, which I think you can get a really good idea of if just reading that intro to the Grundrisse, because I think he gives a very clear point on the limitations of his own thought, in a sense.
Yeah, on top of Marx, I guess something else I kind of wanted to, that kind of you sparked in my brain of thinking while, I guess, going over what I highlighted at the very least, is kind of there. We're going to talk a lot about ethnology today, I understand, but like it's particularly with Moos and Bataille, which I think are probably two of the bigger influences, at least on the primitive territorial machine chapters. It is kind of interesting, in addition to Marx, kind of what flows they add to the discussion of these changing societies. Because kind of one thing I want to, I guess, long in the future from now, go over is kind of the myths that capitalism is founded upon. One of which is kind of the bargaining myth, which is kind of more of a, in my view, or my understanding, kind of more of a misunderstanding of, or Europeans misunderstanding other societies, more than anything true in itself, where they go over to these other societies and see one person giving goods to another person and believe that it's some equivalent exchange where money would make it more useful. And then in the 20th century, Bataille and most go back and be like, hey, they're not just trading goods. They're also trading all these other types of flows. There's status in this, there's alliance in this, there's filiation in this, that we'll go on and talk about. But there's all these other communicative things that are going on, that it's not just about everything leading up to money. There's all these things that society also imbues these not yet commodities. What I don't know exactly what to call them, because it's not a capitalist commodity yet. Are these items, mystical or not, they're imbued with these values that are separate from their usefulness in these societies. Whereas when you go back and try to think purely through the capitalist mode, you try to put everything back to this plane of equivalence, where one thing traded is worth what one gets out of it. And that just doesn't work when you're viewing anything, I guess, kind of pre-capitalist, because so much more is communicated through these items than just kind of the value at an individual level. I don't know if anybody else has any comments on that, or if anybody wanted to mention anything separate before we go on to the primitive territorial machine next.
Yeah, no, so I think to understand exactly this problem with the gift and money and these exchanges, like we have to understand what anality is, and what the relationship between money and the anus is, like, which is just it's so fun. It's just so, like, okay, like bottom 142, right? The last paragraph. Our modern societies have instead undertaken a vast privatization of the organs, which corresponds to the decoding of flows that have become abstract. The first organ to suffer privatization and removal from the social field was the anus. It was the anus that offered itself as a model for privatization at the same time as money came to express the flow's new state of abstraction. Okay. So this is one of those privileged moments I was trying to get at before, where the anus is the model of privatization, but shit is the model of abstraction, of absolute abstraction, of the sort of decomposability of everything into shit, right? And it's on one hand a joke, which they love to sort of pepper into these things, but it's on the other hand a completely serious observation about privatization, the sort of becoming private of the body, the organ hyphenization of the body, is a sort of participates in some way in this thing that they call the thing, capital T, the nightmare of capital that every socius is trying to guard against and negotiate with. But then we get into this other stuff about how, like, you know, the earth is one gigantic anus, and we all, like, you know, and I really struggle with this. I love Freud. The stages have never clicked for me. And so if anybody has an account of how this works, please.
So from my understanding, the anal stage is that of organization. So like cleanliness, I guess at a Freudian level, is associated with this. But thinking back to the second chapter for the flow of shit that you were talking about, like, yeah, it's a joke. It's funny to talk about shit, but also that is kind of, if you think of the anus, that's the territorialized partial flow in a way. It's what the anus should be partial towards, in overcoding way. I don't exactly know how to use all these terms quite yet. I'm still figuring it out. But that's kind of the proper use of it in a way. There's no other things the anus can do. It becomes, not only does shit get its own room in the bathroom, it's also the only thing you can do with that object. I could be going off on a little off tangent, but that was kind of what I was thinking of going to that. It gives a cleanliness to it, a territorialized partiality to it, and kind of that both of those combined gives it this notion of individuality. There's no social aspect to using the anus.
Remember what they say later, that only the mind is capable of shitting.
Yeah, what the fuck is that? Like,
I mean,
like no effect. Like, I mean,
I think that's in relation to Artaud talking about the flows of writing and flows of
Right.
shit, right? So I
Right.
think that's again, it's a tongue-in-cheek type of thing that you were mentioning, John.
right.
Yes.
Tongue in cheek, really, man? Come on.
Someone mentioned a few sessions ago that they really wouldn't want to hear, they wouldn't really want their family to hear them talking about Deleuze or listening about Deleuze. Because unless you know about what it just sounds like we're talking about shit and cum. And it's like,
I mean, we
why?
are.
I guess we understand why they're not on YouTube at this moment. Whoever these people are.
And they insist throughout, these are not metaphors.
No, these are not metaphors.
Not metaphors.
But I like that. I like in this paragraph here, just after, or right about the point that Taylor just mentioned. They say that a sublimation in its entirety is anal, and but you skip the next top of the next paragraph. The whole of Oedipus is anal, and implies an individual overinvestment of the organ to compensate for its collective disinvestment. And this idea that Carson just said, Cameron just said, of anal as organizational. I mean, the Oedipal is such an organizing structure, all encompassing, and whatever, I'll keep using it, but please stop chuckling, guys. Tongue in cheek, however tongue in cheek this happens to be, in some ways, I think they're that middle of that paragraph, when they talk about the phallus, the Aufhebung, the Aufhebung that will constitute the phallus. I think they're engaging with Lacanian theory there, and sort of a little swipe, as it were, and then but moving on to more important stuff. I mean, they can deal with Lacan at other points, but nonetheless, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot packed into this. I guess my rule of thumb, it took me quite a few years to come to this, was that don't get stuck, as it were. I mean, it's gonna bog you down. I agree. I don't get. Okay, I'll just sit here and contemplate for the rest of the evening the little parenthesis. Only the mind is capable of shitting. I mean, that's sort of like a Zen koan that we could just the master has whacked us on the head with a stick, and just contemplate for yourself for the next 3 weeks. What that means. I mean,
it's a Lacanian utterance almost, right? Like it reminds you of the Lacanian axioms.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, they like those little bits, and who's to say? I mean, somewhere deep in the notes the Guattari produced, there might be this little string that Deleuze said that would be really great right there, and then let's just move on. I mean, I don't know. I don't know, but I mean, I think the bigger picture here is they take the shift, as it were, in this introductory section through the psychoanalytic, which they just treated at great length in the previous chapter, and then they're moving on to. I mean, actually, they follow this through into the next page, into 144, where they're coming back to. I believe that they're sliding into the syntheses once again, and with the primitive. Before we get to the actual section, the primitive territorial machine, they introduced the primitive territorial machine right there at the end of this chapter. So they're sort of making the segue here. Not that what I've just said resolves anything, but this paragraph that begins with the whole of Oedipus is anal, I think it's sort of their way of making a bridge, if you will, into what really matters for them in this whole chapter, is to get on with sort of laying out this march, if you will, back in history, and then move back forward to the end of this chapter. So.
Yeah, I do. This was also a paragraph that the puzzled me a bit in that way. I do one thing that did help me a bit at least is it does seem clear that they are eventually leading towards. I think earlier on I had a note. It's at the top of page 143. But the concerning the anal nature of the monetary economy, right? Foundationally, right, value is abstract labor, objectified. And so I think that when they're, I'm still working through this, but I do think that when they're speaking of, the ways in which I believe they have another line in here about how the various organs themselves are kind of abstracted. It seems like that they are sort of leading towards that kind of thing, and in a sense, the anal nature of the monetary economy could also be a reflection of the capitalists' relation to the commodities that they produce, right? The commodities are basically the shit that it necessarily must be produced and then expelled into the market in order for them to get their surplus value. And so I don't know. I don't really have anywhere to go with that, but maybe that could be a little helpful with this section.
And not to bog us down, I do not want to get us bogged down here, but there is this. It's interesting because, Lacan talks about the gift of shit, right? That anality is the entrance into sociality, because the first gift is always a gift of shit, and it's the child shows the parent, like, look what I did, here you go, and that is the sort of it's the first gesture of love is to shit properly, and social love. And so when we talk about, and so this is again, this seems like roughly an endorsement of that position, that this is again a kind of, they're sort of endorsing Althusser. This is almost a Lacanian gesture, not to get us stuck in the politics of early 70s French academia, but it's interesting where the endorsements come and where the distancing comes, and it's a totally limpid and fluid line that they're tracing between these other major figures who they're engaging with and explicitly rejecting, but implicitly borrowing and stealing from. That is, just, I guess, the enactment of the book in the way that the thinking happens. And this is where, yeah. But we should move on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I guess if I can get the final comment on this section, I guess I haven't spent too much time with Lacan yet. I got to do a little bit of a class section this semester on him, particularly with, I guess, the earlier parts of childhood development, because that's kind of, Lacan spends a good bit of time discussing that. But one of them is kind of this entrance into language, which I think is to some degree also similarly timed with anality, if anality doesn't come slightly afterwards. But it does seem that there's kind of this similarity into the humanity entering into what would be the primitive territorial machine, if there's anything before that. I guess non-societies entering into societies, as well as I guess a child finally entering into society via, I guess, leaving the real and entering into the symbolic and imaginary fields, and that they're no longer polyvocal. They've established anality, and they've, I guess, established this task. There's this thing I can do with this. I can't do everything with this. Things can't be undifferentiated. There has to be particular investments that I give in certain ways I express myself, or express certain organs or needs or desires, etc. They must be differentiated. They must be given to some degree a purpose, a meaning that comes with the introduction into society for a child. And I guess it becomes somewhat of a metaphor for the entrance of society of, I guess, ancient humans to some degree, entering into this primitive society. But I guess this is a good bridge to start discussing what the primitive territorial machine kind of is and how it functions, if asking how it is even a truly Deleuzian question.
Well, we start with one of the main things, and I know I'm kind of jumping maybe into the middle of the section, but and they may have already even indicated this in the first one, but its main function is to code, right? Is to code the flows and provide inscriptions. I think they even say something like, things, women is the example they use, only circulate if an inscription allows it, right? So the primary function where we should start is with inscription, with coding, because they will want to, one of the distinguishing features for each of the machines, the sociuses will be different types of dealing with the flows. So we have coding, we already kind of mentioned overcoding earlier with the despotic machine, and then decoding with the capitalist machine. So maybe we could start there and add on, is my suggestion.
Well, that coding seems to be the means by which the machine itself functions through what they call a declension of alliance and affiliation. And that little phrase, the declension of alliance and affiliation, in some ways summarizes this second section, because the marking of bodies is all part of that, and particularly the alliance aspect of it. But I mean, alliance being a horizontal structure, with affiliation being the vertical structure, going through, and these two structures are intricately connected, and that's how the primitive machine operates through this. So I mean, the funny thing is, I found this particular section, obviously there are a few spots that I go, what? But basically I got through this fairly quickly, just because maybe it's a question of familiarity with this particular stage, as it were, of their the development they're making. And also, just to say that they come back to this, a lot of this stuff, both the primitive and then definitely the despotic, in the seminars, particularly Anti-Oedipus, 1,000 Plateaus 5, that's 1979-80. There's 13 sessions there, and several of them are dealing with a lot of this stuff. But also in 1,000 Plateaus, I mean, you can just Google, if you can get your PDF of the text, and then Google to your index to your heart's content key terms, because a lot of this stuff is back in there. Mumford's Mega Machine, and many of the key references that they're bringing up in this whole chapter, but this section in particular, you see them come up again, developed in a broader fashion.
Another thing that I found helpful was talking about some of these basic prohibitions that aren't related to incest, but at least structurally and now analogically, you can kind of relate them. They point out Pierre Classer, who in his Society Against the State, he's talking about the prohibition of the hunter to consume his own kill, right? And so there is this exclusive disjunction whereby, because of that prohibition of of consuming your own kill, there's a social bond that is generated whereby the family of the hunter has to rely on the success of the other hunters. And so there's a kind of circulation of consumables on that level because of that sort of primordial prohibition against consuming one's own kill. And I think they mentioned this on page 148. Yeah, in the little parenthetical towards the bottom of that full paragraph. But to go back to something that John said about the hunter as the initial paranoiac, right? They end that paragraph by saying, in short, as we shall see elsewhere, there's always a pervert who succeeds the paranoiac or accompanies them, sometimes the same man in two situations, the bush paranoiac and the village pervert. So they're kind of looking at towards Cluster, and there's a great little, I think it's called Influx. This is this round table that Pierre Cluster has this kind of beautiful extolling of this chapter, and how he says, like, you know, we've always known this, ethnologists have always known this, anthropologists have always known this, but they never really pointed out that the primitive function of the territorial machine is to code the flows. So you got some confirmation from outside of their field of expertise about some of the rigor they put into, and Charles mentioned it, how much study went into writing specifically things like this chapter.
Yeah, one thing I find interesting, and I know Cooper pointed out when y'all were talking about these first three chapters for your seminar series, Taylor, is that like I guess at this coding stage of the primitive territorial machine, everything in hindsight kind of looks very restrictive. The restriction of incest that we'll get into the last chapter, or not the last chapter, the next chapter, as well as this kind of the restriction against the kill. In hindsight, it looks restrictive because we're primarily thinking in like individualistic terms, I guess. But in another way, it kind of, the restriction is the only thing that grants the possibility of society for these, I guess, primitive communities to some degree. In that not eating your own kill means that it's possible to have a family at all, because they also get to eat. Or as we'll discuss, incest isn't just a prohibition, it's an opening to the next door tribes,
Right.
the tribe leader's daughter or something like that. Every restriction is not just a restriction on the individual, it is the opening into which the individual can connect to either his own community, his her or their own community, or create something between their own community and another. It's always connective in some way, rather than just being a wall that the individuals put within.
Right, and this is where Bataille and Mose come in, right? Because it is in order to function that a social machine must not function well, right? It cannot be too streamlined. There must be these breakdowns, because the breakdowns are the moments in which sociality appears, like as misfiring, which is just
Right.
It's just so fucking good. This is one of those moments where, like, you know, I see my underlines from all my past readings of this being like, yes,
Right.
that's in like 3 different colors. Like, this is, you know, in a way, like the essence of where Deleuze and Guattari go into these formulas that almost gather this material together.
And one of the ways I understand that, John, and obviously it can apply vastly because it's such a general kind of axiom, is the way that, you know, and I know that Cam hinted at earlier, especially specifically like towards Mose, when he's describing these exchanges of goods that have attached to them a little bit of surplus value. I know that's not the right word for it, but it's you're always giving back and then some with interest, because you're trying to, because in the circulation of the gift, you're accumulating prestige, so you've got to give back with a little bit extra. And so, but at a certain point, a minimum of stock has to be reformed, right? This can't go on perpetually, right? There is a kind of limit to a certain point where everything has to kind of be, if you will, start from zero. And so I kind of take that as one way of reading that line that you brought up about the machines. You know, they function by breaking down.
Yeah, and they function by producing waste too. I mean, that's where I was thinking about Bataille more than Moss, right? Like that's waste is this sort of like gathering function, like the gathering force of society. It's that around which people gather are these sort of ceremonies of food being burned or of waste, and this is what and the sort of the in a way, it's an interesting reading of Capital, because according to this, the thing with the capital T that they warn about on, I guess, 153 is the perfectly functioning machine, right? That they identify with Capital, that sort of would, I guess, not code the flows, but sort of set the flows free in a way that is without remainder.
Right.
Yeah.
Perpetually displacing the limits, right? And reimposing them.
Yeah,
Right. It perfectly accounts for everything. You know, everything is closed up as opposed to open.
Yeah, which would fail to produce waste, which would fail to produce the link, like the social link, which is in a way like what Engels talks about, you know, in, you know, as far back as the, you know, conditions of the working class. You know, we have a world of monads. You know, like Leibniz was right, just not in the way that he thought. But yeah,
I think that is a good kind of drawback to Bataille, because when I was going through the Accursed Share, I don't know, 6 or so months ago, it does kind of seem that he ends up kind of basically coming up with a schema where there's production on one end, or pure production on one end, and pure consumption on the other. And you don't really want to hit each of those, even though there are major societies that like function some way or another for some given time that are purely one or the other. Tibetan monks being pure consumption, and I don't think American capitalism up to Bataille necessarily got to 100%, but the Muslim empires, I think, is one of Bataille's closest examples to near pure production or pure expansion and growth and stuff. And it does seem that this is kind of trying not to hit either side of that spectrum. Is probably not necessarily explicitly said, but an important part of, I guess, the machine breaking down. You don't want too much production, or else you don't want to focus too much on production, or else you're not going to have the consumption to maintain the society that you already have. And you don't want too much consumption, because that just leaves a bunch of waste that you're not growing in order to kind of replace and maintain the, I guess, social festivals and relations that are already going on. So each one kind of ends up being necessary to the other, but there's just so many societies that think, or like the machine working perfectly would be running towards one of these sides, trying to just purely elevate your individuals to some degree of pure consumption, whether that's knowledge or hedonism, falls apart, and you need this other society to protect you, which is what happened in Tibet's case. Or you just kind of have to devote yourself to the Muslim empires end up having all these internal restrictions that come about because they're so focused on this expansion, which, I mean, Bataille's, I guess, focus may be limited, or I might be missing a few things here and there. But that's kind of the connection that John kind of got in my head thinking back to Bataille when I was reading him 5 or so months ago. But go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts here actually, and maybe something to reply or to think with John about when he was talking about how they are using others and stealing from them and like readapting them and criticizing them. I think in like the end of the page 146, they have a very interesting way of using this Marxist structure of thinking about capital for the primitive societies. Affiliation is administrative and hierarchical, but alliance is political and economic. They're just very Marxist like terms, right? And expresses power insofar as it is not fused with the hierarchy and cannot be deduced from it, and the economy insofar as it is not identical with administration. So very Marxist way of thinking. So this is my feeling when I read actually Deleuze with the writer, with the philosophers he is like going with, like Spinoza, Bergson, Leibniz, or the ones who is against like Kant. He is like giving them the full, like taking them to the extreme in some way. And then instead of being the Spinoza Deleuze, he makes Spinoza Deleuzian in some way. And I think that we can think of this way of like being here also Deleuze being nomadic in his way of moving between different ways of philosophies and taking from them and mapping this kind of territories. So this could be also something to think about, because you are right in many ways. And I was reading an essay by Dan Smith about Lacan and about Deleuze and Guattari and Lacan, and how Guattari was saying something like, I have never been beyond Lacan. So, but also so there's something here going on. But actually, so this is my general thought about this part, and also to reply to something John was saying. But I'm very, very like a little bit confused, because we think of savages or primitive societies in the Deleuzian terms as nomadic groups, right? But it seems here that they are not nomad. And maybe Charles, if he has any thoughts about that, or anyone else, I'm not putting you on the spot, I'm sorry. But I'm just really curious and trying to think, okay, we have been thinking of these primitive societies as nomadic groups, as nomads. But here, they are not functioning as nomad. Here, fixed capital, like this is a continuation of the last paragraph of 146. Filiation and alliance are like the two forms of a primitive capital, fixed capital or filiative stock, and circulating capital or mobile blocks of debt. So we are not talking about any kind of nomadology here or nomadic. So how, maybe I missed something, but how did we do this kind of movement from thinking of the savage or the primitive as a nomadic group to become like now they have the seed of the state? What will be the state?
I don't read them, particularly in this chapter, as restricting alliance affiliation to nomadism.
Okay.
I mean, this is a much more general discussion, if you will. And even though nomads are mentioned within this, I mean, they're just one group among many. I don't think that's. I think I've got three cats here now. We're I don't want to, yeah, I'm like talking about becoming animal. And I would say we're pre-nomadic at this point in the book. It's obviously the nomads have their place too, but I think at this point they're trying to deal with more general structures. I mean, that's how I read this.
Yeah, no, I think my sense of this was that these readings of the savage socius are totally tied up with like Levi-Strauss and the Baroro and the stuff from Tristes Tropiques, which is all about, for Levi-Strauss, societies that seem to have remained relatively stable in their social organization for what to him appear like hundreds to thousands of years, like the Baroro people who seem to who don't not have a history. He never claims that they don't have a history, but they seem to have sedimented their sort of social mores so intensely that they almost don't live almost, as opposed to nomadic groups, which are the outside against which the savage group, which is all about marking and carving and inscribing. The nomad group is, in a way, at least I've always read it as opposed to the savage, the savage social. I forget what the exact term is. Does that make sense? I mean, and of course, like there's no absolute one or the other, like, because they are in these sort of symbiotic or whatever the opposite of symbiotic relationship is. But
Parasitic.
yeah, no, I mean, like, but this gets developed in War Machine, but it seems like it's the seeds of the War Machine chapter that have not yet been fully thought through. I don't know. Yeah, no, it's really good though, because there is slippage here that there isn't later on, it feels like.
I would just add, I think this is a great point Mahmoud brought up about, because I think I used to have this idea too, that primitive territorial machine was specifically about nomads, but for me, I think after thinking more about how this theme becomes much more fleshed out in A Thousand Plateaus, as John kind of mentioned, just thinking back to the fact that when they talk about the illegitimate and legitimate syntheses, or the uses of the syntheses of the unconscious, nomadism in my mind most specifically is related to what is it, the synthesis of consumption. Am I right? Like, where it's about the segregative versus the nomadic use, right? The segregative use would be illegitimate, while the nomadic would be legitimate. So it seems as though in this book, and I could be wrong because I haven't I haven't controlled every nomad in the book, but it seems like nomadic here is a descriptor of this legitimate use of the synthesis of consumption, rather than being thematized in the nomadological way that will become much more prevalent in ATP. Although I will say, as one caveat to this, that Deleuze was already thinking about nomadic distribution in specifically logic of sense, and maybe even in difference of repetition. I'd have to go back and look. Charles, you might be able to say a little bit more about this in logic of sense, since you had a hand in translating that text. But I believe, Deleuze is already thinking about the nomadic in terms of space, and the distributions of things within space, rather than, say, dividing space, as they even point out, I think, at the beginning of this chapter, right? So I would just say that it's almost more of this philosophical category, primarily, rather than what it will become more so in A Thousand Plateaus, perhaps, in taking on an anthropological dimension proper. But I could be playing a little fast and loose here, so I'll just stop there.
No, this is really very helpful. Yeah, yeah, because they are sometimes like, in some way, it can be very fluid in their movement. They are very rigorous in the way they use terminology and concepts, of course, but also sometimes they can be quite fluid, and especially in this work more than any other one they wrote together, as if they are still trying to find. I'm not going to say harmony, because Deleuze said there was no harmony, but a kind of like two paces in some way. But yeah, this is very helpful, Taylor.
Well,
Thank you.
You're right. I mean, on page 148, they have a whole long paragraph in which they are talking about the great nomad hunter. In fact, I believe Taylor, a little while ago, read the final sentence about that. But in any case, they seem to be tapping into Pierre Clastres' texts. But again, I take the nomad hunter as an example. I mean, this is because if you look at the next page in 149, we're talking about a different kind of setup altogether in terms of this flow deductions, constitute affiliative stock, and then they give an example on the blanket that serves as a familial stock. Okay, so imagine a blanket out there that's got the familial stock, as it were. Athanal stones or cowries are made to circulate. So they have another example. This could be within the nomad encampment, but it could be a fixed place as well. So I guess I'd much prefer it to be they're dealing with different examples, drawing from different examples here to make a more general statement, but that doesn't preclude them from tapping into specific spaces. They do say, though, on page 148, that they're talking about the nomadic space, the space of encampment, but a pure nomad does not exist. There is always and already an encampment where it is a matter of stocking, however little, and where it is a matter of inscribing and allocating, of marrying and of feeding oneself. So, it's like the smooth and striated. You can imagine striations up the yin yang. we were into them every day. But there really is no such thing as a pure smooth space. There's always some level of a mixing. And in the 1,000 Plateaus chapter, even prior to that chapter, the one that precedes it, but particularly in smooth and striated, they talk about that mixing, and that's true, obviously, in terms of nomadism.
I think what you were saying, Charles, is like makes me think of very important novelist in Arabic contemporary. He's called Ibrahim al-Koni. He is a Libyan writer, a Libyan novelist, and most of his novels actually translated into English. And most of his novels are mainly on, he is a Tawarig, so he is like mainly talking about the Tawarig groups, that are like one of the last nomad groups in the world now. And you are completely right. Like there are a lot of codes for this kind of group that we think of. We think of them as like pure nomads, the last nomads. No, there is a lot of codes between the humans and non-human, between the males, the females, the woman, and the man. So even what some of his novels considered like misogynist, but he keeps like defending this, like I cannot be politically correct when I'm thinking, when I'm writing about this kind of society has this kind of political correctness in their own codes. So yeah, just as a thought over what you were saying about this kind of pure nomadism, there is not, yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess unfortunately I'm gonna have to go soon. There was just one thing. I don't know how helpful this will be. Unfortunately, I haven't read Bataille or a lot of their other influences, so I don't know if, because it seems, at least Cameron, from your description, it seems like Bataille has a pretty different conception of production and consumption from Marx, but maybe I was misinterpreting. But one thing that I found fascinating is the discussion of fixed and circulating capital. Circulating capital is also Marx refers to as fluid capital. I found that very useful because, in a sense, you can the distinction, which is kind of annoying, is essentially in the fixed doesn't refer to like the placement of the capital. Like it's not a spatial reference. It's only in reference to how their value is transferred in the production process. So fixed capital is like a machinery which would over a long period of time slowly break down and transfer its value bit by bit. Whereas circulating capital, which includes labor power, the workers themselves, transfer their full value into the product, and then they are what circulate throughout the economy to be returned back as and they transition from productive capital to commodity capital to money capital, and then back into productive capital. And so the fixed capital is not fixed in space, but it's fixed in form. It's fixed as productive capital. It can't be in any other form. And so I found that interesting. As I mean, maybe I don't know if there's much to go with here, but I find it interesting thinking about the nomad hunter example that they use there. The nomad hunter themselves is very much like the circulating capital, where it they leave they leave and hunt and then bring back their surplus, so to speak. And so I don't know. I find it interesting that they posit the alliant and the filiative along the lines of fixed capital and circulating capital. And moreover, the discussions of stock play an important part in volume 2 in terms of how the capitalist necessarily must build up stocks of both money and of means of production in order to properly reproduce their capital. So I don't know. I guess I don't have a real conclusion to that, but I did find that kind of analogy quite interesting because fixed and circulating capital are such a specific distinction. But I do think that there's at least I found it a very interesting way of describing the ways in which the filiative and the alliant sort of interact with one another and form the kind of reproductive process of the society. But anyway, unfortunately, I'm going to have to go in a couple minutes. But this has been great. I've really enjoyed talking with you all. So
I'm
Thank you
afraid
for
I'm
joining us.
failed too in a few moments. So
Yeah, well, thank you both for joining us. Like I said last time, I probably have cut this into way too many huge chunks because there's just so much to just one thing after another to kind of bite on in this chapter.
yeah.
But if y'all can stay for a few more minutes, I would like to start talking about the problem of Oedipus chapter, just so that we don't drag on until 11 o'clock tonight. Or the people willing to stay, at least. We've kind of gotten into it a little bit, especially with the economic questions of, I guess, at least physical bodies of the trading of women and the alliance formation. But is there anything else y'all would like to, I guess, go over that y'all saw as fundamentally important in this chapter, I guess?
let me say that this is like one of those chapters, and I've encountered this in many spots in this book where I really just pick the book up and say, I'm glad it's a big one, so I can just bang my head against it a few times as I'm going through it, because there are a number of distinctions that they develop here in relationship to Oedipus, and I guess I'm thinking on 155 here that the 2 points of view they develop in the center, that takes you down the filial lineage. What do I say? The economic and political versus the mythical. Okay, so I mean that doesn't seem to cause that much of a headache, but when you turn the page and then you start going into the weeds with Levi-Strauss, I just sort of go, okay, then we go into Marcel Griol's research, and so they're bringing so much out of the different kinds of research that they've been doing, sort of taking this deep dive into this to get back, if you will, later in the section to talk about, what I'm trying to say is you lose the bigger picture, and why. The question is, why is this called the problem of Oedipus? And the answer is, well, is there a universal Oedipus? And that's the big question that they're trying to address. And where would that kind of idea come up? And what in these different theorists, researchers, anthropologists that they're reading, what is there that might support such a thing, or at least nuance such a perspective? And so, I mean, this is just one of those those sections that kind of drives me crazy. In a lot of there's so much in it. And then when you finally get to the discussion, I think that they want to suggest it's all the way at the end here, back on 164 and 165. We get into the territorial representation. Middle is 164, and then questions of repression, the repressing representation, and I guess I tend to get rather lost and frustrated in these kinds of sections. I mean, I just basically run to the final paragraph and say that will be the summary paragraph, right? And will allow me to no, it's not. Well, in some ways it is, because they don't. This and the next chapter, the next section are a real pair, and they're extraordinarily dense. But at least they get into talking by the end of this section, and then into the next section, they get into talking about this, the Oedipus within this kind of the primitive territorial framework. But it's as if in the section that we're looking at, the problem of Oedipus, they got to sort of rev up to just really leap into it, and then psychoanalysis and ethnology, the next section, will then, we've already given you the background on this, say Deleuze and Guattari. Now we can really get into talking about this, and I just want to say thanks, guys, for all the work you've done, and I want to get into the next next section. So I'm talking to Deleuze and Guattari now. Thank you guys too, but yeah. So anyway, this is a cry of help for help. Also, this is the one where the idea of germinal influx comes in. I think didn't you add? Excuse me, germinal influx and germinal influx. This is where that pops up in this book.
I mentioned that being one of the places where I would like to have a better grasp of that concept, because it's precisely the very fact that the germinal influx, as far as I understand it, is precisely where incest gets sort of attached onto in order to block that influx, right, and turn it into this extension. And that's where the illegitimate uses of the syntheses come in, right? So it kind of is as though this germinal influx is what is being corrupted and distorted in order to lead all the way to Oedipus, if that makes sense, right? And so I would love to understand that more, and I know that they kind of brilliantly elaborate it, specifically based on like the myths of the Dogons, and as you mentioned, Gilles was one of the people, but it's something that I feel a little less confident talking
about. So like, if I can give this a shot, okay. My sense of how this is working and what the point of this is that you have to read this with the One or Several Wolves chapter of ATP, where the point is that in Freud's anthropological texts, what he says is that the whole network of prohibitions that permeate savage societies, as in the sort of the German anthropologists of the late 19th century that he's reading to write Totem and Taboo, this whole network of prohibitions are expressions of the fundamental incest prohibition, which is, don't have sex with your mother, right? And what Deleuze and Guattari are doing are saying that Oedipus is the consolidation of a pre-existing network of complex prohibitions. The savage society is the world of marking and a world of universal marking where everyone is marked. And the despotic society, the barbaric society, is one in which one figure, the despot, the father, is marked. And Oedipus is the consolidation of all the other prohibitions. And they are seen to sort of flow from him or emanate out of him. And it's a move that they repeat over and over again, where they, especially with regard to Freud, where they say like you're seeing one where there are many, or you are turning many into one, or you're, as opposed to turning one into many. And it's a methodological point, and it's a kind of like an ethos point almost more than anything that is being worked out here. And it's a sort of a rewriting of the primal father myth, where Freud says, first there is the primal father, and then the sons, the alliance of sons overthrows filiation and institutes the world of. Here they're saying first there's alliance in the savage setting, where there's these you can, if you've ever read Levi-Strauss, he has these incredible diagrams of like the various houses and villages and all the different filiative connections and alliances between families within the villages. And they're saying first there is alliance, and then there is filiation, which sort of overthrows alliance in the figure of the despot who consolidates all of these flows. And the details don't really fucking matter that much. I mean, they do matter, obviously. Like, it would be totally, I mean, that would be the ultimate anti-Deleuzian move, is to say, like, actually, it's just, but that's the sort of the essence of the gesture. And it's a gesture that they repeat over and over again. And the point and the takeaway is not the individual anthropological readings, but the maneuver, which is to say out of one many, as opposed to out of many, or is to emphasize the many of that relationship. And to see Oedipus as consolidation, not as original. Cut.
And he leaves the room.
It did do a mic drop.
So bad. I'm
Drop the
sorry.
mic.
I will. I
Mic
do have.
drop.
Okay, I'll be right back. Bye, guys.
Hey, listen,
Thank you, Charles.
I gotta head out. Yep.
Yeah, I gotta head out too. But this
Thank
was
you.
a ton of fun.
Thank you
Um,
both for joining tonight. If you guys don't join, again, just thank you for being here. This is such a productive conversation so far. But if you do, you are both welcome back with an open invitation. I think both of you are in the Discord, so conversate via text or on these next few sessions.
Yeah.
Okay, take care.
See ya.
Right.
And then there were 4. Yeah, these seemed a lot more dense than when I was doing my syllabus. Which is why we're 2 hours in and on the 3rd chapter of 8. But one thing I found interesting, I think this is slightly off topic, or it's slightly redirecting the flow a little bit backwards, is on 161, the impossibility of incest, I thought was an excellent thing. And I think John might have kind of mentioned this to some degree. But just kind of for, I think it, what is it? The last line of the last full paragraph on 161, the one the paragraph that bleeds over for 160, is for incest is like this motion, it is impossible, and it is not impossible in the same sense that the real would be impossible, but quite the contrary in the sense that the symbolic is. And then in the next paragraph, what I have highlighted is the possibility of incest would require both persons and names: son, sister, mother, brother, father. Now, in the incestuous act, we can take persons at our disposal, but they lose their names insomuch as their names are inseparable from their prohibition that prescribes them as partners. End quote there. All of that on 161 of the Penguin translation. I didn't get that on my first reading, and it was just such an interesting, I guess, addition to it, in that the names, the relational names, I guess, son, mother, uncle, aunt, etc., are not just names out of like some naturalness to them, but they're societal names in some way too. In the way that you maintain the relation with them, or the proper relation, the names stick. And the second that those prohibitions are crossed, the names are either tethered, sort of thrown away, or don't exactly exist at that moment. So I guess what Deleuze and Guattari are kind of saying, they're not necessarily saying sleep with your mother. They're more saying that if one of the persons in these societies were to sleep with their mother, they wouldn't necessarily be sleeping with their mother, because their mother, that proper name, also holds within itself the incest prohibition. So to commit incest with the mother is also at the same time for her not to be the mother at that moment. So it becomes paradoxical and, I guess, impossible in their way of saying it. That was just something that kind of stood out to me. I didn't know if anybody else had any thoughts on that.
Yeah,
They use.
that's another.
I was just. Go ahead.
No,
I guess I'll designate Taylor first, just to ease everything up.
Real quick, I was just saying they have this metaphor, and sometimes they can use metaphors, I think, but they say that the name is like a stamp that is too wet and it slides off, right? It slides off of the person. So it's only with the illegitimate uses of the syntheses that we get something, and specifically the sense of connection, that we get something like a global person that would allow the name to stick, right? So it's only from the illegitimate point of view, from the point of view of the prohibition that constitutes the global person, that this phenomenon of making the stamp stick works. Anyway, go ahead, John.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's exactly where I was going to go. This idea about the stamp sliding, right? So in Lacan, this is like the function of the father is to quilt the symbolic order, right? To be the guarantee that says this name will not slip, because the father is who he says he is. Right? Like he is the one being that is who he says he is, that then guarantees that the rest of the symbolic order holds together and doesn't slip. Like this is so like, and like you never get your mother because she won't be your mother, even if you have sex with your mother. That's not real jouissance, blah blah blah, like all that stuff, right? So like, but what's interesting with that is like to read that with Foucault, who is obsessed, and they're very much Foucauldians in this point, with getting an account of desire beyond prohibition, right? Because desire is a structure in psychoanalysis that is inseparable from prohibition. You always want what you can't have. You want because you lack, and you lack because you can have, but you can never get to. What they want is a vision of desire that's not structured that way. And so what they're saying is, nonetheless, the despotic machine of the signifier institutes prohibition as the only legitimate form of desire, which I'm struggling with. Because like it's hard for me to imagine a structure of desire that's not based on prohibition, that's not based around lack. And I think this is why they turn to Spinoza. But yeah, that's my sense. Please, Mahmoud.
No, you just took it out of my tongue. I was thinking about Spinoza when you were, but I want to go to Cameron actually, because yes, this paragraph is very, very important, and I think I will go back to something I said in the beginning. The idea of the possibility of incest would require both persons and names. So I think names here is what they will mean by overcoding in the dispute, right? And going to the prohibition, what John was mentioning, I think I go back to the religion as this kind of earlier form of overcoding, because the presence of religion is what will prohibit you from doing this with your mother or doing this with your daughter, etc. Right? So it was this earlier form of like, this was like the transcendent way of thinking of how to overcode, to strict, to repress desire in some way. And in the same paragraph, actually, he says something like, The names subsist and designate nothing more than pre-personal intensive states that could just as well, between quotation, extend. This is the third line from the last.
Yeah.
As well extend to other persons, as when one calls his legitimate wife mama or one sister his wife. This is actually, until today, we have something like this. Like in Arabic, for example, in some communities, the daughter can say to her father, my love, habibi. In doesn't mean anything
Right.
sexual. It is just this kind of extension to the other in many ways, in some way. And so this is like the remnants. This is what remained from that time with us until today. How the figure can still like maintain this kind of the pre-personal intensive state. So this is very, very interesting. I'm not familiar with one sister, his wife. I'm not familiar with this. But yes, I know that a husband can say to his wife, mama, or the wife can say to her husband, baba or daddy. And it doesn't mean any kind so this is before Oedipus. This is before Oedipus. Like so to go back and think of it like retrospectively in the context of Oedipus is in some way is a misreading, I think.
Right.
Because there was no any kind of context, there was no overcoding there that could make you prohibit this kind of signifying in some way. So yeah, this is just my main thought about this part, because as Cameron was said, like it's very important and it's like as if it takes the blanket out of your eyes and it makes you see much better how things were before. And makes me hate Freud more, actually.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, no, I totally, yeah.
So I would like to get to the despotic machine before too long, I guess. So are there kind of any comments on 4 or 5, really? I do want to keep it moving so we don't. I know there's a lot here to talk about. Okay, bye Taylor. Thank you for coming again.
I too, I am being summoned by my partner. I think
this might be a good place to stop, honestly. Yeah. So
let's talk this bit next time. Let's just only the despotic stuff next time.
Yeah, that would be a good thing to do. We can try it and I guess meet again later. This also makes this YouTube video watchable somehow, so it's 2 hours instead of 12. But thank you all for coming. Even though we only got through the first 3 chapters, everybody here was just, oh my god, just one thing after another. Very productive. We were I guess a good assemblage is the best way to put it. But
we would
thank
make
you.
a terrible sumo wrestler, but we did our best.
We'd have 6 hands. We would be a great sumo wrestler in that we'd be too, or no, we'd be too efficient. We were doing Deleuze too well. We weren't breaking down enough. But I guess anybody coming from the YouTube, as I always say at the end, up until, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks from now, this will be an open reading group. You can join. The Discord links in below. Thank you both for joining, and hope to see you again next time.